Why is the skepticism towards our own side, but not against people who profess themselves to be our enemies? And that is the case with Hamas. When Hamas releases figures and the BBC and others just report the figures as if they're the figures,
but
that's
the figures,
very...
It's an important detail, but it's not... you can have the argument about the figures, but clearly a lot of people have been killed.
Absolutely.
And to some people's mind, too many, whether it's 10,000 or 50,000, it's still so far beyond what would be morally acceptable.
Well, it's not, of course, because we've morally accepted that for many years in conflicts which we support. Nobody wanted to know how many people we killed in ISIS-controlled territories after the attacks on Paris and elsewhere. We weren't interested. And nobody bothered to find out. We trusted that the Kurdish fighters did their job, and gosh, did they do their job, but we didn't work out what the collateral damage was in places like Mosul. And that's because we wanted ISIS annihilated. We didn't want them to be able to rampage through Paris and other places. Well, the Israelis have the view that they also don't want terrorists rampaging through their towns and cities and parties and much more. You can get onto the actual figures. The best figures we have from any Western military expert, John Spencer from West Point, who some people are dismissive of because, again, he's not Hamas, so why would we trust him? He's merely an American military expert. His figures, he says that it's about a 1-to-1 terrorist to civilian casualty ratio. Maybe that's the case. I would very much hope it's the case, and it would be the lowest such case of collateral damage in warfare in our lifetimes, and certainly much lower than what the British and American militaries have been willing to tolerate in terms of civilian casualties.
Douglas Murray is holding a mirror up to the West, and the reflection is ugly. He masterfully eviscerates the performative sympathy for a society that celebrates death, a death cult bankrolled by our own sickening hypocrisy. While the media manufactures saints from sociopaths, Murray asks the one question that leaves them speechless. This is the intellectual slaughterhouse you've been waiting for.
To bring up a new generation of Gazans, to believe that they should live in peace beside their Jewish brothers and sisters. History would be different and Gaza would look different today. But they didn't take that choice. I believe that it's perfectly true that some people will write a completely morally neutral view of this, but I'm not morally neutral on it because I believe that it's an extremely clear choice.
I'm not saying this is true, but I'm wondering, would it have been strengthened to include more sort of evidenced signposting of the fact that you've spent time thinking about the experience of the other side? Maybe you could have talked to relatives and friends and people who are in touch.
I think I've done plenty of that, and I quote plenty of the leadership. As I've said before, there is a technical problem of reporting from Gaza, which is there's two ways in. You can go in with Hamas or you can go in with the IDF, and my preference was for going in with the IDF. By the way, the journalists who have gone in with Hamas get a much more one-sided view of it, because Hamas, if you go in with the IDF and you criticize Israeli actions, you'll be lauded. If you go in with Hamas and criticize Hamas, you'll add to the number of hostages. I don't take that as a valid critique. People know where I'm coming from, and I don't hide where I'm coming from on this.
Because I think we started this conversation thinking about who is Douglas Murray, what is the kind of what is your intellectual approach to these problems? And I think that is really at the heart of it, that what you would call moral clarity, rejecting the both sidesism, the relativism, which made you have strong views on Iraq back in the 2000s and means that you have strong views now. That's your sort of trademark. It's that you look at a problem, you say, okay, I've decided that this is right, and I'm going to say that without fear or without caring if people don't like what I have to say.
Douglas Murray rightly notes that journalists criticising Israel get awards, while those criticising Hamas get kidnapped. While the West endlessly debates moral relativism, Gazan leadership has spent decades indoctrinating its children for martyrdom, with polls showing over 70% of Palestinians supported the October 7th attacks. This isn't a conflict, it's a war against a death cult. How much longer must we entertain this delusion?
And some people experience that as a kind of black and white, a sort of Manichaean worldview where you're dividing into goodies and baddies.
Yeah, I think any reader of this book will see that I express, among other things, deep sympathy and empathy with the people of Gaza where it is appropriate. But I'm also not by any means blinded by moral relativism about it for lots of reasons. One is that when the Gaza was handed over to the Palestinians in 2005, and the then American administration very unwisely encouraged elections in Gaza, and Hamas won and then killed their Fatah opponents and then never had another election. When they did that, they made a set of very, very serious mistakes. But if you look at the footage from the morning of October the 7th, and you see the footage of, for instance, raped Israeli girls being paraded through the streets of Gaza, or girls who've had their tendons cut so they can't run away being taken on the back of jeeps, or indeed the mutilated body of Shani Laouk. If you see the footage of these girls and others being taken into Gaza, an 80-something-year-old Israeli pensioner on a buggy, you will see the citizens of Gaza in their entirety, and the visible ones, celebrating. They celebrate this. The men will hit the naked bodies of the women or beat them or spit on them. And there is this societal glorification in death. And the Israeli hostages that have been released, and there are still dozens in captivity as we speak, 1.5 years.
Douglas Murray details the sickening street carnival on a strip in 2005 and Qatar funneling nearly $2 billion, which Hamas notoriously diverted for terror infrastructure. This isn't a government problem, it's a societal sickness. How much evidence is needed before we stop pretending these are innocent bystanders?
If you speak to the people who have been released from captivity in Gaza, none have stories of any Palestinian in Gaza showing them even the least bit of humanity. And I would submit that this tells us not just something, but quite a lot. If a truck came down the road now in Westminster with any type of terrorist group parading the bodies of raped girls, I think even in London today, we would expect that the public would turn on the people doing that, would stop them from doing that, and would hate them for having done that. I'm not sure that sitting in London, people realize the extent to which Sinwar and the leadership of Hamas spent their 18 years of governance in the Gaza trying with considerable success to create a generation of sociopaths.
So do you think most people in Gaza are sociopaths?
I think that the generation that has grown up under Hamas has been taught that. And it's much to the detriment of the Palestinian cause that that's the case.
As you point out those videos, people cheering, do you think it's more than 50% of the, if you were to guess, of the inhabitants of Gaza who are sufficiently supportive of what you call a death cult that you can fairly call them bad people?
If the Palestinians in Gaza can rise up against Hamas, and there was an attempt the other week by some people, it seems, including a very brave young Gazan man who was promptly tortured and murdered and his body dumped on his family's doorstep. You see several things. One is, of course, the grip that Hamas still, sadly, even after the decimation that Hamas leadership has suffered.
It's a society of sociopaths. Hostages saw zero humanity because for decades, UNRWA schools, bankrolled by the West, have poisoned minds with curricula that glorify martyrdom and Jew hatred. UNRWA materials teach jihad and demonize Israelis. This isn't a Hamas problem, it's a cultural death wish we funded. Why are we still pretending they're anything but a generation raised to kill and be killed?
In the last 18 months, they still have a grip on the Gaza, and as long as that's the case, and as long as the hostages are still there, the war can't end. Because those are the two stated war aims of the Israelis. The second thing is that it is the nature of totalitarianisms and of death cults when they own a society, run a society, that rebelling against them usually is deadly. We speak on the day that the news comes out of Mario Vargas Llosa's death. I recently read his great masterpiece, The Feast of the Goat, in which he talks about the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic from the 30s to the 60s. And it's, among other things, a brilliant reminder of exactly this, that a dictatorship can, people say, why don't people rise up? And one reason is that the people who rise up get disappeared. And that's a hell of a lesson to keep everyone else down. So it's possible that the Gaza has a significant number of people who would like Hamas to be overthrown, but they just don't have the capability to do it. Everything I've heard, first and indeed secondhand, suggests that that's just not the case. If there is a rebellion against Hamas now, it will be in very large part simply because some Gazans may by now have got wind of the fact that the destruction of Gaza, significant amounts of Gaza, is caused by Hamas starting a war.
So it sounds like you do think most people, at least we can't be certain, but it would appear to you that most people within Gaza are supportive of this death cult.
It seems that way, I have to say. And I would just add that even after these years of indoctrination, funded and fueled, among other things, by our taxpayer money.
Murray brilliantly exposes the West's favourite fantasy, the silent majority in Gaza just waiting to rise up. These people didn't rebel when Qatar's billions built terror tunnels instead of hospitals. They only cry now that the war Hamas started has ruined their homes. After 18 months, with polls still showing massive support for Hamas, why are we still pretending this is anything but a society celebrating a death cult?
UNRWA and other organizations that were meant to oversee the education of Gaza, what textbooks you see that they've been using. I'd like to think there could be a de-radicalization process, but I think there's no one capable of the job. I don't think that there is a burgeoning liberal civil society that wants to live in peace with their Israeli neighbors. And until such a time comes about and until such a generation emerges, I do believe that the conflict continues. And that is why I've said completely openly from the beginning, my hope always has been that this is not the umpteenth Gaza war, but the last one. This isn't the third Lebanon war, but the last one. And for that to happen, the leadership of Hamas, Hezbollah, has to be not just defeated, but to be seen to be defeated, which is why the intelligence and military successes against Hezbollah in September last year were so striking, because it was Hassan Nasrallah, the late now head of Hezbollah, who said many, many times in his misspent life that, as he said, the weakness of the infidel, he said, is that they love life, whereas we love death. And this is the weakness we can use against them. The leadership of Hamas said the same thing. They always said, as jihadist groups and death cults like them always do, they said, we love death and you love life, and that's how we're going to win.
What do you say to people who sympathise deeply with what you've written about in this book, are completely appalled by the events of October 7th, also realise the depth of the problem?
For years, Western taxpayers, via UNRWA, have funded a curriculum of hate, churning out generations who celebrate the slogan, "We love death more than you love life." This isn't a political disagreement. It's a death cult's war on life itself. While the West preaches tolerance, they nurture sociopathy. When do we stop funding the very schools that teach children to become martyrs instead of doctors?
How far-reaching it is within societies like Gaza, and yet still find it morally unconscionable to kill as many people as the Israelis have found it necessary to do in their counter-assault. Is holding those two positions simultaneously just both sidesism and lack of moral clarity, or can that position be a respectable one to you?
I understand it and I disagree with it. I understand it because I think a lot of people are very, very misinformed. They've done two things. One is that they've imbibed Hamas figures about the dead in Gaza, which, by the way, Hamas revised down quickly the other week. If the CIA were to release figures, skeptics across the West would say, but how can we trust the CIA? I think, although it's not so degraded in this country in terms of the trust. I think that if MI5 released a set of figures for the dead in, say, or MI6 released figures for the number of people that our armed forces and the French and Americans killed with our Kurdish brothers and sisters in Syria and Iraq in the last decade. I think that if MI6 released the figures, there'd be significant skepticism about it. So why again, and this is a sign of what I was trying to describe earlier, is why is the skepticism towards our own side, but not against people who profess themselves to be our enemies? And that is the case with Hamas. When Hamas releases figures and the BBC and others just report the figures as if they're the figures.
But the figures, it's an important detail, but it's not. You can have the argument about the figures, but clearly a lot of people have been killed.
Absolutely.
And to some people's mind, too many, whether it's 10,000 or 50,000,
sure,
it's still so far beyond what would be morally acceptable.
Well, it's not, of course, because we've morally accepted that for many years.
Media outlets like the BBC instantly parrot casualty figures from Hamas, a literal death cult, while treating their own intelligence agencies with suspicion. It's pathetic. Remember Mosul? Over 9,000 civilians died in the US-backed fight to crush ISIS, and the world yawned. But when Israel defends itself, suddenly everyone's a humanitarian. Why are they so desperate to believe terrorist propaganda only when the victims are Jews?
In conflicts which we support, nobody wanted to know how many people we killed in ISIS-controlled territories after the attacks on Paris and elsewhere. We weren't interested. And nobody bothered to find out. We trusted that the Kurdish fighters did their job, and gosh, did they do their job, but we didn't work out what the collateral damage was in places like Mosul. And that's because we wanted ISIS annihilated. We didn't want them to be able to rampage through Paris and other places. Well, the Israelis have the view that they also don't want terrorists rampaging through their towns and cities and parties and much more. You can get onto the actual figures. The best figures we have from any Western military expert, John Spencer from West Point, who some people are dismissive of because, again, he's not Hamas, so why would we trust him? He's merely an American military expert. His figures, he says that it's about a 1-to-1 terrorist to civilian casualty ratio. Maybe that's the case. I would very much hope it's the case, and it would be the lowest such case of collateral damage in warfare in our lifetimes, and certainly much lower than what the British and American militaries have been willing to tolerate in terms of civilian casualties in war. I agree in that, of course, many people who are not actual fighters at the time, terrorists in Gaza, will have been killed. That is all down to Hamas, because Hamas have used the conflict, as they always do, to hide in civilian buildings, dress in civilian clothes, torture people in civilian houses, fire RPGs from mosques, launch rockets from hospitals, use hospital basements as storage points, use churches as arms dumps, and so on. If you do that, you will inevitably invite civilian casualties, and that's what Hamas wants. Now, that produces a serious problem.
Hamas openly weaponizes its own civilians by firing rockets from hospitals and storing arms in churches. This isn't collateral damage, it's calculated PR, turning inevitable deaths into propaganda gold. Per West Point expert John Spencer, Israel's 1-to-1 civilian-to-terrorist casualty ratio is historically unprecedented in urban warfare. Still, the world recoils in performative horror. How can a society that intentionally sacrifices its children ever be considered a victim?
For the IDF and the Israelis in their response, my observation is that they have performed as well as an army could in those exceptionally trapped, deliberately booby-trapped situations. But when people say, I just can't bear the idea of civilian suffering, can't it all just stop? I have a challenge for them, which I've put out a number of times. I have yet to hear an answer for. Israel is a country of 9 million people. Britain is a country of, almost 70 million people these days, I think. What would it be? It would be about 9,000 British people being murdered in one day, and about 2,500, say, kidnapped. What would you do? Extrapolating out by population, what would you do actually if, even though Israel is much smaller than the UK, What would we do if not 22 people, as the girls who were massacred at the Manchester Arena bombing were killed, but if 1,200 people had been killed on British soil in such a barbarous way, in their homes and much more? What would we do, even much bigger a country as we are than Israel, if 250 British citizens were kidnapped into territory very near to this country, were known to be being tortured and raped and brutalized for 18 months? What would we not do in Britain to get them back? And let me put it the other way round. If anyone has a better way of getting back the hostages and killing or capturing the leadership of the group that carried out these atrocities, please send it to me and I will send it on.
Douglas Murray asks what Britain would do with 9,000 murdered and 2,500 hostages. They raised their terror alert to critical after just 22 died in the Manchester Arena bombing. The pearl-clutching idealists demanding restraint would be screaming for absolute annihilation if this happened on their soil. They have no answers, just hollow virtue signals. What magical, peaceful solution are these keyboard warriors hiding?
To the chiefs of staff in Israel and to the Israeli War Cabinet, because I know they would be fascinated and interested to know if there was such a policy. I hear occasionally from comedian types that negotiation is the way to do it, and they point to the fact that in some of the pauses in the fighting, Israel has managed to get some of its hostages back. That's true. What they utterly fail to understand is that no hostages have been given back because Hamas has suddenly turned into a liberal group. They have been given back because young men and women of the IDF have been fighting for 18 months in Gaza and in Lebanon to exert kinetic military force to force Hamas to give back the hostages. But if various comedians and others have a different plan, I'm all ears.
Final question before I let you go, and in a way it returns to where we started. In this book you write, "Friends and family occasionally remarked that I had changed. Readers sometimes noticed it too. Has this past couple of years changed you, and if so, how?"
Very much so, actually. And the book finishes, as you know, on a rather positive note, because of the two conflicts I've covered in the last couple of years, the Israel-Gaza conflict, and although I've managed to spend less time there, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I've been deeply inspired by being with frontline fighters in both war zones. I've covered many war zones before, but both of these wars have felt different to me for various reasons. And really it's because it's people in societies I recognize as being similar to our own, being tried and tested and raising themselves to the moment. I was with a unit.
Murray has been changed, not by the horror, but by the inspiring courage of societies he recognises as our own, Israel and Ukraine, who, when tested by barbarism, are raising themselves to the moment. So, any thoughts on what Douglas Murray just discussed? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of our future debates.